Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking about recent supply chain developments and the proposed Ocean Shipping Reform Act with Congressman Dusty Johnson from South Dakota. Congressman Johnson serves on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, as well as the Committee on Agriculture, on which he is the ranking member of the Livestock and Foreign Agriculture Subcommittee. On August 10, 2021, Congressman Johnson, along with Congressman Garamendi, introduced the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here on Supply Chain University.
Thanks for having me.
So it's mid-October 2021. The White House just hosted business and labor leaders at the White House for a supply chain summit to discuss the state of the nation's supply chains. Obviously, there's a huge crisis right now. There were some announcements about actions to be taken by the port community, particularly in Southern California, to try to alleviate some of the current congestion, which has been, as you know, exacerbated due to the holiday season. Do you think the results of this summit will be effective at addressing some of the current bottlenecks we're facing?
Well, let's be clear that it's not a silver bullet. A lot of these, this is a massive problem, and it's going to take more than one type of intervention to clear this backlog. But, some of the things that are announced certainly will be helpful. When you have 24/7 operations in Long Beach and LA, that's going to make some difference. When you've got outfits like Walmart and UPS, FedEx, Samsung, who talk about how they'll step up their overnight activities, that's going to help. But I think this situation has really laid bare some pretty substantial systemic problems. And so I don't want us to think that we should just get out of this crisis situation with some ad hoc solutions. I think we really want to look to things like Congressman Garamendi's and my bill to, I think, make sure that we improve long-term the operation of ocean carriers and our ports.
And so, speaking of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, what was the genesis of that proposal?
Well, I think when you start to see these massive backups, when you see 50 or 60 or 70 massive ships just moored offshore waiting their turn in the ports, you get concerned. For me particularly, I was hearing from so many ag producers and ag processors that they simply couldn't get their products overseas. And then a little bit later on, the supply chain disruptions became even more clear to folks in South Dakota who use items, business owners who just couldn't get raw materials or finished products from Asia. And I think it really caused my team and frankly, Congressman Garamendi's team to dive in and say, so what are the issues? And again, we found that there was not going to be one silver bullet, but that we needed to have a systemic approach toward looking at long-term, how the regulators have more tools in their toolbox to deal with these extreme situations.
And are these type of issues what prompted your support for the bipartisan letter to the Federal Maritime Commission back in March?
Yeah, and of course there are a lot of congressional letters that circulate in any given day, but there aren't that many that get 100 members of Congress on a bipartisan basis. And that's what our letter did. And so, yeah, it was absolutely the genesis for our letter. And I think we've continued to build momentum. We have 150 national organizations or associations that have endorsed our legislation. I think that shows that this is not, like so many bills in Congress, just a messaging bill, an attempt to grab headlines. This is actually an attempt to legislate and to govern our country a little bit better tomorrow than we were governed yesterday or the week.
Can you describe the major components of the bill?
Yeah, to me, and there are more than a dozen, but I would focus on three. I think the headline grabbers. Number one, it makes it clear that if you're going to use American ports, you're going to assume some common carrier obligations, and that one of those common carrier obligations will be not unfairly discriminating against American imports or exports. We have had some situations. This is more on the agricultural product export side, where there have been lots and lots of refusals from these four major ocean carriers to take American products over to Asia. And I think that is problematic. I think unfair discrimination is not the kind of thing that we should just be willing to sit by. It's not a typical situation. I mean, normally when you have commerce going on in our country, people are not allowed to unfairly discriminate against cargo. And our bill would do that. Number two, would make it clear that these large ocean carriers would need to file some basic data, some additional basic data with the Federal Maritime Commission. What they file now is very, very limited, and it makes it hard for the FMC to properly diagnose problems at the ports. And some of this additional data, and this is not intrusive stuff. This is basic information on tonnage, basic information on refusals. That's going to help us better deploy regulatory tools. And then finally, there have been so many complaints on both the import and the export side about detention and demurrage. And the carriers have been exercising those tools in ways that are unfair. I believe that there's ample evidence for that. And so all we said, we shift the burden of proof. We say if you're going to apply these massive detention and demurrage fees, as a carrier, you really need to be the one who proves. You have to meet your burden of proof before you stick folks with these large bills.
Yeah, and on your first point, I was talking to Gene Soroka on the program, and he was mentioning that the head of the Port of LA, and he was mentioning that the percentage of empties containers going back to Asia has typically been about 50%, and recently it's been about 75%. I think he's said before that our biggest export these days seems to be air, and so clearly this is not a sustainable situation. And so I think efforts at addressing that imbalance are certainly welcome when there's sales that can be made and aren't being made due to congestion issues. What would the bill have any impact potentially on addressing some of the current supply chain issues, or is it more of a long-term play, or is it both?
Well, I think it is more of a long-term play, but I think very clearly it would help on the margins with today's situation. I don't want to overstate that. I mean, clearly we have unprecedented consumer demand, and our bill is not going to make that go away. Our bill is not going to create more containers overnight. It's not going to create more port capacity overnight. But it will better align the interests of the four largest foreign flagged ocean carriers with American shippers. And that will have, I think, again, on the margins, it will make for a more efficient system. I think it will nudge people into some of these exchanges. I think that kind of technology would improve the efficiency overall in the system. And I do think it's a part of the solution.
I'm curious, what, if anything, are you hearing from the administration on the proposal?
Well, we have not heard a lot from the Biden White House. We have heard a fair amount from the FMC. Of course, that's an independent regulatory agency, but their views, I think, are generally respected. And I think when you look at somebody like Commissioner Dye or Chairman Maffei, they understand these issues. They have said lots of things that are supportive of the concepts, and I've enjoyed my conversations with them. We do want deeper engagement with the White House. I think when you see this tremendously large number of national associations and tremendously large number of members of Congress who are supportive of our concepts, it is time for the White House to get engaged, and we're looking for more of that from them.
And what's the current status of the legislation, and how are you looking to move that forward?
Well, we need to get the Coast Guard reauthorization done this year, and that is a relatively good vehicle for us to attach some of the components of our bill. We're running out of time in 2021, as I think everybody knows. Congress has not been very good at getting our job done. And so we've just got cliff after cliff, major legislative deadline after major legislative deadline. Admittedly, it's going to be a little difficult, I think, to get almost anything outside of those four major legislative issues done. But listen, there's a path forward. Again, I don't want to oversell it, but could Coast Guard reauthorization get attached to some infrastructure vehicle that's moving? Yes. And could our concepts get attached to the Coast Guard reauthorization? Yes. But we're not just, it's not just a single track approach. We also want to make sure that if we have to move into 2022, we have some legislative options there as well.
And one last question. You mentioned that there's no one silver bullet to this issue, and obviously there's the summit and there's the legislation that you proposed. Are there other actions that the administration should be taking to alleviate the congestion?
Well, this is a little far afield of your question, but I do think our federal government putting trillions and trillions of dollars into, out on the streets has clearly prompted this unprecedented level of, spending on consumer products. And I don't know that long-term our nation's best interests are being served by that. And so I think when I look at something like the $3.5 trillion social safety net package, I would want to see a lot more modesty, I think a lot more targeted investment from the administration than these massive $1 trillion giveaways. It seems like we've had one after another after another. And I'd rather be a country that sees investments rather than just money giveaways. And I'd be a lot more supportive of investments in port capacities than just giving out more stimulus checks for Americans. That's not serving our long-term.
Well, thanks so much, Congressman Johnson. Really appreciate your coming on and looking forward to continuing the discussion as this issue develops.
Sounds good. Thanks much.
And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube where you can like and subscribe. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.